Welcome to this beginner's tutorial on React. This will be an introduction to React, and for it we'll need Node. So if we haven't already downloaded it, please download this recommended for most users version of Node, because we'll be using npm for handling our packages. And this will be the application we'll create. It's a to-do list. So we're retrieving data from an API from Json Placy code, and we can search and filter through our to-dos that we have left, and we can also add a to-do like washing here, for example, and we can also click off that we've checked the to-do, or we can go ahead and we can delete it. So that's what we'll be building. And notice that we have some nice components that have been pre-built for us, like this navigation bar and these buttons and these icons and cards and checkboxes and stuff like that. And for that, we're just going to import this library material UI, and it's just the npm installation, and then we can have access to all of these pre-made components. So let's go ahead and get into it. The first thing we need to do is create our project, and I've already created a folder here and I'm in React to-do list. So I'm going to need to create React app npx, notice the X instead of M, and I'm just going to call this to-do list, and I'm going to do this dot here to do it in the current directory. So that'll just take a moment to load. And it's creating the React app for us in this location here. So it's generated this project for us, and it's actually done it in a to-do list folder. So that wasn't exactly what I was after, but nevertheless we can just cd into it. And if we take a look at our application, we have a few files, and whenever we're working with a node-based project, I always like to take a look at the package.json first, just to see what we have inside. And the package.json, this is just where all our libraries and dependencies are. And we'll notice that there's three core ones that we have here. So we'll ignore these testing ones because we won't be dealing with testing at all. But we have React, and of course we need the React library to be able to use the functionality of React. We have something called React DOM, which relates to the the DOM in the browser, and we need to get this in separately because some of these React applications might be using React Native, for example, or a different React technology, and they don't necessarily have the DOM, so they're separated out. And then we have React scripts, and this is how we can run a few of our scripts, and most importantly to us is this start script. So that will just configure our files together that we've created and put them together, and it'll make it so we can display the React app in the browser. And the readme, that's just, and git ignore, they're just standard files. So when you're working on the project, you can ignore the node modules, for example, which is just a massive folder of all of the dependencies, and there's a lot here because lots of dependencies have dependencies of their own in npm, but we won't necessarily be looking there. But when we do install something like React scripts, that goes into the node modules, but we can just ignore those in the git ignore. And the readme is just obviously the readme file, which displays the instructions to run it, and we can see that we've got this npm start here, and that is the main script that we're running here. Now, more excitingly, we can look at this public folder, and there are a few things like the ICO, so the icon that displays in the top left of the screen, and a few PNGs and text files, but the only real file of interest that we're after here is this index index.html, and it's in this index.html that our React script or our React JavaScript gets injected. So this is just a regular HTML script, and this is essentially our application here. And the whole application, it just runs on this div here. So there's this empty div here, but it has this ID of root inside the body. And what this is doing is, this is just a placeholder, and our entire application actually gets injected here. So if we take a look at the source folder and we open up the index.js file, we can see that what we're doing is we're getting an element by ID. So this is the only element that we can access, is this root ID. And what we're actually doing is we're rendering to that ID using that React DOM. So we need to manipulate the DOM, and we do it the React way, so we can render the entire application into the root ID. And this service worker, that's not really of interest, but we'll just leave it there because it's given to us. That's just for offline capabilities. But yeah, we have React, we have React DOM, and this React strict mode, this is just pointing out errors for us. So, you know, while we're developing, we can catch errors and things like that. And then it's importing a CSS file, so the corresponding CSS here. And yeah, and then it imports this app component. So this is a JavaScript, and it just does the regular sort of DOM manipulation, but in the React way. But it's putting in this app file here. And this app file, well, now it's a function, but it used to be a class by default. And what this is doing is, this is essentially, we need React to be able to create that. And there's going to be the logo and the corresponding CSS. So if we look into the application, okay, so that's the what we're aiming for. So I'll just sort of stop that server on the other screen. But if I do an npm start, oops, I do an npm start, this will load up the server, and this will show us the React application. So there's this logo, and then there's this text and this tag here. And if we take a look back into our app file, you know, we got this logo, we're getting that CSS, and what we're doing is we're returning, using this app function, we're returning the image, the text, and this tag here saying learn React, which we can all see here. Now I'll just clear up a little bit here just to point out that if I save this, you know, there's hot reloading, so it renders in the browser for us, and that's really nice to do in real time. And I also just wanted to point out this syntax here. Now everything inside of here is just regular HTML, but this is actually JSX, so it's very similar to HTML, except there's a few things we can do here. Like if we have these curly braces, we can actually, everything inside this will be JavaScript. So we import this logo, this SVG, and that corresponds to the path that's given here in the file structure. And then whatever that logo path is, we can sort of inject that in. And we can do that with our own variables, so we could define our own variables in this here, and we could, you know, we could just say, like, for example, just the const x equals 5, and if we wanted to, we could just write a h1 here, and we could use this curly brace, and we could just say 5, oh sorry, x, and below this screen here we got the number 5. So we can sort of see how we can mix our JavaScript and HTML together, and the idea from a single page application is, rather than have the separation of the HTML and JavaScript and CSS, each component, such as a navigation bar, has its own self-contained code with its HTML, CSS and JavaScript, and then we can reuse that, and it just makes it so that if there's any problems or anything like that, we can identify them easier, and it's also more reusable and cleaner. So another thing to notice is, rather than class here, we have class name, and that's because in traditional in JavaScript there's this class syntax, and it originally actually was the class syntax, so I could actually change this to the class app, and this extends components. So this is sort of the object-oriented sort of way of doing things, and when we do it like this, we don't necessarily need to have what was that? We don't necessarily need to have it in the same format as before, but what's going on here is, rather than this return here, what we need to do is we need to nest that in a render function. So we need to render everything in here, and then we can go ahead and we can return that. And it's yelling at us because we don't have, firstly, the class app, that needs to not have this function syntax, and we don't need this, but we will need component, and we can import that using this destructuring syntax. So we can use it like this, and if I save that, and we can see that our application is still the same, so it doesn't break or anything like that. But what I wanted to point out was, because we have function-based classes and function-based components and class-based components, this class keyword is actually already taken by JavaScript. So that's why we can't use our regular class and ID for our styling or DOM manipulation attributes. We have to use this class name here. And I might actually go ahead and just delete this. And when we're returning something, we do need to have this outside div here. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now we don't need this logo either, and we don't need this app CSS either. So we'll just clean everything out here. So I'll delete that. We don't need the test file either, I'll delete that. And we don't need the logo either. And we'll just keep the service worker there, but we'll set up tests, we can just delete that too. And we can just check that everything still works okay. I'll just put something in here like hi, and we get this hi here. And I always just like to have F12 open, just have the console open just in case it points out anything for us, using Google Chrome of course. And okay, and one thing to note, if you're not completely sure with the destructuring syntax, is this functionality can actually be imported like this as well. actually you don't need to import this component at all. We're importing everything from React. But that means if we try to save this, we'll get a compile error, because on the React object itself there's this component functionality that's being used here. So you might see it written like this, but more nicely and commonly used is this sort of destructuring. So we're getting that functionality out of the React and we can just reference it like that without the object dot notation. So yeah, this is a basic class. This is the app. This is the core. This is like pretty much the starting point of our application, in the sense that this app here, this is rendered into our DOM by accessing the root ID in the HTML and injecting everything in there. So I can close those two up now, index and that, the HTML file. So now what I'd like to do is just sort of remind ourselves of what we're doing, and we are going to build this. So I want to get material UI in, so we have access to the components, and I also want the material UI icon so we have access to this rubbish bin and stuff like that. So let's start off by bringing in material UI and building this navigation bar. Okay, and for this I'm going to actually stop with a Control-C, and I'm just going to do an npm install at material-UI/core to get all of the core functionality. And I'm also going to want material-UI/icons. So we'll just give that a moment to load, and I'll just open this package.json because I'm preempting some new dependencies here after it's done loading, of course. And we can see that up the top here we have this Material UI core and Material UI icons. So I might go ahead and close this now. And now we'll actually go into creating our first component. So in the source folder, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call those components. And I'm going to create a component called navigation. So these components conventionally have a capital first letter here, .js. And this is where we can begin to write our first component. So in the navigation, what we can do is we can sort of build our class-based component. And I actually have this extension here. Where is it? Let's see, did I go scroll past it? ES7 React and Redux /GraphQL by DSC, and that just helps us build or lay out the bones or the structure of the components. So I can actually type in React component RCC for a React class-based component, and if I hit tab here, it actually generates the default. And we can actually see that this is quite similar to the main application, where we're importing React and component. And one thing to note is to use these components elsewhere, we need to export them. And there's two key ways of doing that. One is we can define the class and then we can export it, or we can just export it in one go. So it just really depends on your preference. It does the same thing, But one thing to note is this default here, and this default, basically what's happening is it's just saying that, okay, there's only one class in this file that we're exporting, or we can export it as one file. So when we import it somewhere else, like in the index.js file, because we're exporting it as default, we can import it without the curly brackets. But if we were to, for example, use it in the destructuring way, and we had multiple classes and we just said export app and then export another class that we had, that would mean that we would have to import it, or when we export it without the default, we have to import it with the curly braces, just for the destructuring of it, similar to this component for React component. So anyway, what we need to do now that we have our first component in the navigation by extending component React component, we need to render something and return that. So we're going to need a few things here, and this is actually a lot easier than making it ourselves or anything like that, because we have Material UI now. So we can come here to Material UI and we can just look at the different components on this website, and we can more or less just copy the code, since we have access to it. Now we've installed Material UI, but from Material UI there's separate imports for separate functionalities, such as the toolbar and the app bar, and we'll actually just use the app bar to get the whole bar and the toolbar, and we'll also use typography just to, you know, get the font variant looking different from our core base font. So we can go ahead and import that functionality, and if we look at this code here, we actually, when we extend it, we can actually import this. So I'm just going to import these three here and just have a look at the app bar, position static, the toolbar, and within the toolbar we have of interest. We just want to have just this word here, so we can just say typography with a variant of H6, let's say. So let's do that. Very simple. We import that. Now, instead of having these divs here, what I might return instead is the app bar. And this is going to have a position equal to static. And there's two types of components. There's ones that are self-closing, and there's ones that have stuff inside them. So it's sort of self-explanatory in the sense that, you know, the toolbar is within the app bar, and within the toolbar we have the text, or the typography they like to call it, and on that typography we have a variant equal to H6, and I'm just going to call this to-do list. If I save that and I run it npm start again, we can see that, and I'll just open F12 up here. So okay, so we'll notice that, okay, well, we haven't got our component just yet, and that's to be expected because we've created the component but we haven't referenced the component, and this is where we'll see the self-closing way of doing it. So these are contained components, and this app here is just rendering high at the moment. So what we can do is we can actually import the component, because we've exported it as default in the app where we're rendering our entire application. Basically, we can actually go ahead and we can import the navigation component. That's what we called it, navigation, and that's in the components folder. So from dot slash components slash navigation. And for JavaScript files we don't show the JS, but for other extensions we do, like CSS. It's just by default recognized by React as being a JavaScript file because that's most commonly used in the JavaScript framework. And so with that we can actually render our application. So we don't actually need this div anymore because we're going to be able to return the navigation. And if it's only on one line, we don't need any brackets around it, but if it's more than one line, we will need brackets. So we get a compile here, and cool, now we can see our navigation bar here. So that's great. So now what I'd like to do is just take a look at our application here. Now we've got a few things going on here. We've got a search bar, an add button. We're rendering a card for each one of the items. So what we'd firstly like to do is to be able to get these items. And there's a website called Json placeholder.typicode, and this allows us to make sort of fake API requests. So rather than set up our own API or anything like that, we can just use fetch to this website, and we'll just do these to-dos here. It's the very first one you can see here. And if we actually just go to that website to-dos, we can get a particular to-do, but we're more interested in all of the to-dos. And you can also limit it. So rather than having all these to-dos, let's just say we want the first 5. Well, we can just do this query here in the URL by saying limit equals 5, for example. And then we get these 5 responses. So if we just take a look at the data structure, we have an array of objects. So we have an array of to-dos, and each to-do has a corresponding user ID, an ID, a title, and whether or not it's completed. And it's just dummy text, of course, but that's all good. So what we want to do is actually, well, first things first, how do we get that data into our application? So okay, so what we want to do is we want to use the fetch API that's in the browser, and we want to get that information from this URL here. So I'm just going to copy this URL, and let's just try and get it into our console to start off with. So in React, there's lifecycle methods, and one of the lifecycle methods is component did mount, meaning after the component's mounted. So in this case it's going to be the app component. When that loads, we can then do our JavaScript, and it's similar to just regular, if you have a regular HTML, CSS and JavaScript file, you load the HTML first, and you have a reference to the CSS in the head tag, and then it goes and gets that, and then it renders the HTML, it renders the DOM, and usually at the bottom of the JavaScript file, of the HTML file, you have a script reference to the JavaScript, and it gets that. And this is sort of doing a similar thing, but for this component in particular. So once the app component's registered in, then did the component mount, and after it's mounted, we can then go ahead and do our network requests. So we've got a class here, and we do everything in the class. So we can just go ahead and we can create a method in the class, and this is going to be called component did mount. And I'm just going to do a console.log here, and I'm just going to say component did mount. But I'm also going to compare this to the regular constructor, and if you're familiar with, you know, object-oriented programming, you would know that. Okay. And I might actually put this render method down below just to sort of show the functionality that we're using first here. But I'm going to call a constructor. So every class has a constructor, and a constructor calls each time that that instance is instantiated. So we're expecting it to happen once. And I'm just going to do a console log here. And I'm going to say constructor. So I'm going to save this, and I'm just going to see what this gives us. See the ordering of things here. Okay, so first we get this error, and that's good. Must call super constructor in derived class before accessing this, or returning from derived constructor. Okay, great. Because we're not just in a regular class, we're using inheritance, and we're extending the functionality of the React component library. We can, or the component in the React library, we need to actually call the super class to reference the constructor from the from component. So we can just do that quite easily actually, just by calling this super method here, like that. And now with that, we should be able to display our application. And what's going on here is we get this message here, constructor, and then component did mount. So that's what we sort of were expecting, is we were expecting that when the app component was created, it will call the constructor, but then after it was mounted, then we get this message, component did mount. So using that lifecycle method, component did mount, this is where we can actually make our fetch request. So I'm just going to copy this URL. I think I already had it in my buffer, but let's just get that. And what we can do is we can actually make this an asynchronous function by using async here. So then we have access to the keyword await. And I'm going to get rid of this now that we understand the order of things. But if I want to get the response, I need to await, and I'm going to use the fetch API. And then I'm going to pass in that URL to get the 5 to-dos. And after I've got those, because it's going to be in JSON format, I need to await another response, and that's waiting for the response to convert from the string of all the text into the JSON object format. So we need to wait for that as well. So we can just say we can wait for the to-dos, and we need to await them, and that's using the response and using this JSON method here on that. And then what we can do is we can just console log to-dos, save that, and let's just see what we get here. And okay, great, we've got data in our application, so we're able to use that now. And the good thing about this React is that it points out errors, and that's probably using strict mode. And it says useless constructor, no useless constructor, okay? And I use that constructor just to demonstrate the lifecycle methods, but now, you know, it's not actually doing anything. But I'm just going to comment it out because we will actually come back to setting our state here. So, but firstly, what we want to do is, if we look back at our application that we're building, is we want to render these to-dos. So the way things work in React is that we have a sort of hierarchy of components, and at the top of the hierarchy, or the closest to the app, is the app itself. So the app itself is the parent component, and then there's children component. So in this example here, this navigation, because we're calling this component within this app component, this navigation component is a child to the app component. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because we're going to have another child for the to-do list. So we're going to have this to-do list as a child, but also within the list I'm going to have a to-do item. So we're extending that concept a little bit of parent and child, so that, you know, the parent is app, the child is going to be to-do list, and to-do list and navigation, they're both children, direct children of app. But then there's going to be a children within to-do list, so that would be the individual to-do. So the way data flows is it flows from the top to the bottom, or from the data needs to be defined here as we sort of started to bring it in here, and then that's going to be passed into our to-do list component, and then that's going to be passed into our to-do. So let's go ahead and start to work on that, and we can create our to-do list, and we can just go ahead and create a new component, and I'll create this new file here, and I'm going to call it to-do list.js, and I can close this navigation now, but I'm going to use React class-based component here and click tab, and that just generates the file for us, and this class name comes from the file name, so that's why we sort of have the capital letters there as well. And okay, so what we're going to do is we will eventually have a nested to do in here, and I might actually preempt that, and I'll just create this new file called to-do.js. But I want to just be able to pass the data from this app component into this to-do list. So how do we do that? Well, in the app component, where we reference the div, so I might just say to-do list here, and then I'm going to import the to-do list here. I'm just doing both of them with a Control D. That means I can have a self-closing component here, and now notice this is where I'll need the brackets, because I'm returning multiple things or multiple lines. So if I get the to-do list here and have the closing bracket at the end there, let's see, oh yeah, and this is another thing to be aware of. When we're making a return, there should only be one container for our application. So we need to have a div here like this, and then we can go like this, and now that we just have one parent container for our return statement, then this should be all working okay. So I can close this now, and we can see that what we've done here is we create a component and we've actually just rendered it here. And sometimes we might not actually want this div here at all. Like for example, let's see here. So when we're calling this app bar, you know, let's say that this had a this was actually a div itself, we might not necessarily want two divs here. So what we can do in this case is we can use something called Fragment. And what Fragment will do is it will be the parent div container, that one parent div container, but it won't actually render the div into the DOM. And we can see that that's destructured from the React library and brought in. So that's just another little React tip. But back to our to-do list. Now that we have our to-do list here and we have this data here, we want to pass that data into this component here. And to pass the data in, we're going to deal with state. So React applications, they have the state of the application. And what that means is it's just a JavaScript object which denotes the state of the application, meaning all the variables and everything is in a source, and that information is used across multiple components, and then that's how we're able to update the DOM and sort of propagate those changes across the application. And that's sort of one of the main benefits of React, is the ability to do that. Now, to do that, let's just create some state. So we'll get back our constructor here, because we want the state to be initialized when the component is created here. And remember, we're passing from the parent to the child. The data flows sort of in that one way sort of model. And we can actually reference this state where this is referring to this class. So this class app is going to be given a state, and that state is just an object. And the state, what we want to do is we want the state to be based on this information from JSON placeholder. So we're going to have the array of to-dos. So we got this array of to-dos here. So we can just initialize it such that the to-dos are empty at start, because component did mount hasn't been created just yet. But when the component did mount and we've made this network request asynchronously and we've awaited that response, we can actually set this state. And this state is a word that needs to be replicated. So we can actually just say, before this console.log here, this.set state, and then we have this arrow function, and we can actually call the destructured to-dos, because we might have more, as our application gets bigger, we might have something else here, and we will have something else. We'll have the search functionality, the search input or something like that as well. So to get these array of to-dos from an object, we can just sort of destructure the to-dos using this object sort of destructuring way here. So that's how we can set the state. So initially the state is sent to an array of empty to-dos, and after the component's loaded, we can see that. And rather than console logging this to-dos now, we can actually say console log this state. And if we look back, we can see that we get the to-dos here, and we get the array of objects. So we're able to have access to the state now. So what we can do with that, we can actually use something called props, or properties, so props for short, so that we can pass into our component. So right now we haven't any dynamic data or anything like that, but this to-do list, it can change, and because it can change, like when we can add something or delete something to this to-dos array, you know, we need to sort of pass in these to-do items into the to-do list, so the to-do list is able to use those and display those however it wants. So in the to-do list we can add props here, and I'm just going to say the to-dos, and we're using JSX here, so the property to-dos is equal to this to-dos object. So whenever we render the application, and render doesn't just happen once, it happens whenever there's a change, and then React and React DOM will, you know, work out the easiest way to change the DOM and the state and make the change. So for example, you add a new to-do or delete a to-do, there's going to be a change in the DOM, and React will be able to render that change. So, you know, there's a seamless UI experience. So that render, whenever what we want to do is we want to get the state at the particular time that, you know, it's been updated and rendered again. So what we can do is we can say we can get the destructured state, so the to-dos equal to this dot state, where once again this refers to the class itself, so the state of the class, and destructuring this to-dos here. So using that to-dos, this is where we can actually pass in as props to-dos. So this to-dos is going to be the array of objects coming from the state, not only the first time, although we'll see it as the first time, but when there's changes to the state of the application. So we've passed in the to-dos, but we need to handle those, and we need to handle those in the to-do list. So okay, so what we're doing here is we are cycling through a to-do. So we're cycling through all the to-dos, and we are displaying a particular to-do. So I'm going to do this across multiple lines here, and rather than to-do list, I'm going to have, we have access to, well firstly I might change this to Fragment, because I don't necessarily want the div there, although it doesn't really matter. You know, if we can avoid multiple divs, why not? So this is where we can use the JavaScript syntax, and recall we can open up the JavaScript syntax with these brackets, and we can actually map through all of our to-dos for our props. So we've passed in these properties, i.e. the array of objects. So what we can do is we can actually access this .props just like that. The to-do list has properties because we've defined properties here, and these props, well, we can access it using this .props. So the props that we're interested in here is this to-dos here. So this to-dos props, which is an array of objects, meaning we can use our JavaScript syntax, so we can map through all of our to-dos and for each to do with a corresponding index, we can actually map this, and I might just return something here, and what I'll return here is I'll return a h1 with to do, and this is in the JavaScript syntax, to do dot title, for example. Okay, so fragment's not defined, so it was auto imported before, but now we need to save that. And there we go. We get our state of our application that's rendered, and the corresponding title is output into the screen using JavaScript syntax. Now, we do get this warning here: each child in a list should have a unique key or prop. And now we're going to use these IDs here as the unique ID. So we need to specify a key for the particular for the thing that we're displaying back. Now I'm just going to go ahead and create my to do, because we want something that looks more like this. To do, and that to do is going to have its own structure, so we have its own component for it, and then that's what will be rendered. So we can make another React class-based component to do. So recall what's happening here. We're passing data from the parent to the child. We have the data in the app. We pass that data in from the state by setting the to-dos prop to the to-dos. Then in the to-do list, we cycle through those properties, and for each of those properties, this is where we want to display, the title, the if it's completed or not. So what we do in this circumstance is we actually pass the data in again from the app to the to-do list to the to-do. So, and there was this error message saying we need to uniquely identify something. So I'm just going to set the key here equal to the to-do.id. But I might also want access to the ID, so I might say ID equals to-do.id. We want the title. That's going to be to-do.title. And we want, if it's completed or not, if completed equals to-do.completed. And let's just start with that. So if we open our to-do, we will want a few things here from Material UI. So I'm going to just open navigation just so I can copy one of these imports, and we will use typography, but in addition we want to have a card because we will want to display this. This is going to be displayed in a card, so each to-do is going to be in a card, and each card is going to have its own card content with some typography. And there'll also be this checkbox, and there'll also be this delete icon as well. So what we can do is we can just import all of those. So there's card, card content, checkbox, and there's also something I'll copy in over from, this is from icons instead of core this time, and that's just the delete forever icon. So what we can do is similar to how we're using destructuring. So this is going to fail, of course, but we can actually, because we have the props passed in to this to do, you know, there's the ID, the title, and completed. These are props. We can access the props similar to how we access the props here, but in this case we're accessing the object. This props to do's this time we've done it in a different way with the ID, title, and completed passed in directly. So that means there's going to be multiple props for ID, title, and completed in here. So what we can do is, to reference that, we can actually just use some destructuring here and get the ID, title, and completed. And this is going to be equal to this dot props. So that means we can use ID, the variable ID, the variable title, and variable completed in the to do, and they'll be the corresponding to do ID, title, and completed. So okay, now let's just go ahead and create this here, and we can use this fragment syntax so we can have an outer container without having an extra div. And now let's start to use our material UI. So we have our card content, and then between our card content, this is where we'll have our typography. Now if we take a look back at our thing, we're going to have, you know, the ID number, the title, the checkbox, and then over here the delete icon. So in the typography here, we can just say, okay, well firstly we'll give it the variant equal to H5 to sort of make it a bit bigger. But then in here, this is where we're going to have the ID dot title, and within this component we'll have a nested checkbox, and this should actually be a self-closing tag in this case, although it doesn't really matter. And then after the typography, this is where we'll have the delete forever icon, and we can give it a color, which is, you know, a material UI property of secondary, and we won't do any events yet or anything like that. So let's just see what this gives us. To-do list. To do is not okay. Let's import to do. And compile that. And we do have some compile errors, but that's all good. Completed is okay. So we've got our ID and checkbox and title, which is sort of what we want. We just want to sort of push it over here. Okay, this is just an unused one. We'll come back to that. Close this now. Might as well close these two as well. Now, we just want to do some styling here. So how do we do styling in React? Well, there's a few ways, but I might just do some basic styling here. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make it so that the space between this bit here and this icon here, so I'll use flex for that, and I've made the I've sort of structured the DOM such that, or the HTML, so that, you know, this typography has the ID title and checkbox nested in it, so that means this delete forever icon is on the same level. And we can actually use a style on the parent of these two here, so card content. And recall that we use one curly brace for JavaScript, but to write a JavaScript object, we'll need two curly braces, and that's how sort of the JXS reads the inline styles. And it's very similar to just regular CSS. The only real difference is that there is the camel casing rather than the dash syntax. And I'm going to make this a flex item, so that means I can align the items in the center. And I can also justify the content, so because it's a row, because it's flexed by default, I can actually use this space between. And this should be justify content rather than justify between. So we'll save that. And we can see that it's starting to take some shape now. We got this on the same line, and this is over here. Now we might just want a little bit of styling on the icon itself. So yeah, so there's a cursor. So let's just go here, and we can do the same thing here, so the double curly brackets, and we can just set that to pointer. Check it out. Alright, cool. So we're starting to get our UI here, we're getting some shape, we're passing our state around and our props around. So now that we have that, what we can do is we can, let's see here, well, we can do this. It can be marked complete. We could delete it, we could search it, or we can add it. So what I might do now is I might do the searching functionality. So for that, I'll need to create a new component, and I'll call this component searchbar.js, and I'm going to make this a class-based component. So there's going to be, it's going to have this material UI text field here, and it looks quite nice with this sort of animation here. So in the search bar, what I can do is I can copy, just say anything to get the syntax, get the import statement alright, and I'll just do a Control D to select these two typographies, and I'm going to get the text field from Material UI. Now what I want to do
is I want to render a div with the text field inside of it, and I'm keeping that div there just so I can have a parent to align it nicely. But this text field, this will have an ID, outlined search. We'll have a label, search. It's going to have some helper text, search for a to-do. It's going to be a variant of the text field, which is the outlined field, and it will have an on change because something will change, but let's just get the shape of it going first. So this search bar component is going to be put above the to-do list, but below the navigation. So let's just get this going. Search bar. And we probably, okay, so it's auto imported for us. Okay, so we've got this search bar here, cool. Now we just want to sort of centralize it and all that. So let's go ahead and do that. So if we go back to our search bar, we can go to this div here, give it some style, give it a margin top of say 40 pixels, display it as a flex item, so it'll be a row as default, so the longer axis, i.e. the row, the horizontal, will be the justify content, so we can center that, and let's just have a look at that. Great, we've got it where we want it. Now what we need to do is we need to sort of, when we search for something here, we need it to filter out the items by their title. So I want to type in say DL, and then it'll just display this first item here and the rest will disappear. So we need to detect if there's any changes in the search bar. So in the parent component on the search bar, we can pass in, so we can pass in props, but this will be the first time that we've seen a method passed in. So we can have this search change, and I can set this to a function within the class. So to access that, I need to use this keyword here, and I'm just going to say on search change will be triggered, and we can create that function here. And one thing to note in React is if it's coming from React, like component did mount or render, we use this traditional sort of function syntax. But if we are creating our own functions, like here, we may want to use the arrow syntax. So I got this on search change here, and this is going to take in an event, but let's just call it for now. I'll just say console.log 123. So if I save that, now I've passed in this sort of method into the search bar, but how do we call that? Because we're not calling it from the app, we're calling it from the search bar component. So in the search bar component, this is where I can have that passed in. So similar to how we have things passed in, like properties passed in, we can actually have the methods passed in as well. So I can just say onChange, because this material UI text field has an onChange method, meaning if you type in the text will change, and then it can do something with it, and that something is going to be based on the props that got passed into it, and the props that we pass into it is going to be this search change prop. So we can access that search change prop, which is a call to the function, and that will call this on search change function here, and that will call the method from the parent component. So if I type something in, and it should be noted that it needs the event to be passed into it. So we can pass in the event, and with the event we may as well console log whatever the value was, so the target value. And if we go back over here and we search for, say, D, okay, we're not getting anything back just yet. And the reason we're not getting anything back yet is because recall that it will be re-rendered, the UI will be rendered based on state, and if there's a change to the state, you'll be able to detect that. So what we can do is, in our state, we can search for the search bar, the search field in the search bar, and with the search field we can initially set that to nothing, right? So we can, when we change the state, when we're rendering something, we can say, okay, well, that search field, we're going to need that as well, so we can destructure that from the state. But with that, what we can do in the on search change is we can sort of set the state. So what I can do here is I can just get the search field, for example, the input from the search field from the event.target.value, and then I can go ahead and go set the state, this dot set state. So I can do that by calling that anonymous sort of function, and then I can sort of use this destructuring syntax. So I've called this variable search field, so this is akin to something like this, but I can just use it like this. So if I sort of, and I think I forgot something here. This should be this props.search change. So if I save that and then I type something in, okay, and it's just simply because I forgot to log the state, so sorry about that. Let's just log the state. So now if I type in anything in here, each time I type something, there's an onChange event, and we'll get the to-dos displayed to us. Now, so let's just recap a little bit there, go back a bit, backtrack. So what we've done is we've created this search bar. This search bar has a text field, and this search bar component with the material UI text field, it can detect changes in the text. So you input something in the text bar, and that calls the method from its parent by the properties passed into it. So in the app, when we call the search change property, we actually can call a method on the app class called onSearchChange, and what we're doing is we are getting the event target value. So this isn't to do with the to-dos just yet, they haven't been linked together, but we're getting the text in the search field just by console logging that. And you know, it takes in an event and we get the event target value as we would in regular JavaScript. And the one caveat is we are setting the state so that the state of our application recognizes that search field and it updates it to whatever it is. So what we'd like to do with that, now we have the new state set, when we're rendering the UI, and that's what I was coming to before, we can use that search field. So recall the render function gets called by React when there is a related change in the DOM or the state, sorry, and then that will be, it calculates the easiest way to re-render the DOM for us. So we just need to say what we want to re-render, and we just want to filter out some of the to-dos. So okay, now that we have access to the state of the input field, we can just filter those through. So let's just say we have this variable here and we'll call this filtered to-dos, and this can be used, well, this can be done by getting the array of to-dos using a higher order filter method, and for each to-do we can return, and what this will do is it will check to see whether or not an expression is equal or if it matches. So if we see that the to-do, and let's just say, so the to-dos, they have this title here, and if that title matches what we've typed in here, we want to filter that. So what we can say is we can return, so if the title, and we'll pass it to lowercase, so it's not case sensitive, but if any of those are included in our search field response, so we can say if that includes the search field, and the search field will be to lowercase. So let's just do this the other way as well, logically. So we type something into the search field and it's converted to lowercase, and if that text that we've typed in here is included in the title from the array of to-dos, so we're going through the to-dos, we're going through the titles of the to-dos, and if any of those have included the search response here, so this will be a string, like a substring of all of the title strings, and if that's included, that means we want that filtered back to us. So they'll filter the results for us, meaning it'll give back to us those filtered to-dos. So now if there are no to-dos, well, we'll display nothing. But that's the filtered to-dos, which is based off the original to-dos. But at the beginning of the application, there's a network request, and we might not necessarily have the to-dos just yet. So based off that original to-dos, not this filtered to-dos, what we can say is if there's none existing, well then it's loading. And we can actually just use JavaScript for this. So we can do like an if-else statement, or we can do a ternary, and we can just say if the to-dos dot length, so that's not the filtered to-dos, this is just the to-dos that come to us, which is 0 initially, but then 5 after it's made the API request to JSON placeholder. But if there is no length of the to-dos, that means, you know, it hasn't made the request yet. So what we can do is we can just return just like a p tag here, let's say, and we can just say loading. And otherwise, we can return this is what we already had. So let's save that. And if I do a refresh, you can quickly see that while it's loading, we get this loading here. So that's cool. Now you might want to set it up so, you know, the navigation comes first and all that, but you know, this is a simple to-do list application here. So now all we need to do is render the to-dos. So this render this filter to-dos, this can be passed in to our to-dos. So rather than the original to-dos, we can pass in this filter to-dos. So initially we get all of our items here, but if I type in, say, del, it gets re-rendered, and we can see that the application searches as how we want. So that's awesome. So yeah, let's just type that in. Yep, cool. Now we want the ability to add a to-do. So we want something like this. We want another one of these input fields and then a button. And then when we type something in this input field, it will make a request and it will add something to our to-dos. So for this, what we can do is firstly we can make a component. So in our components we can create this new component and we'll call it add to-do.js. And in this component we can generate the boilerplate for us using RCC and that extension. So okay, we can actually import something from the search bar, and that's going to be the text field. But in addition to the text field, we also want to import the button. So I'll do Control D on the text field and I'll just type in button here. And we will need to consider the state of the search bar, and we can just like the state in so we've got the text field and the button from Material UI in our add to do component. What we can do is we can return a form, and this form we can sort of copy the styling from our search bar, because we want it centered and displayed flex, we can make the margin top a little less in this case. We can make it 20 pixels. And we put it in a form because on a form in React, they have this onSubmit method. So when you submit the form, we can actually call a function. And we'll call this onSubmit. And we'll just put this up here on submit, and we use the arrow syntax here, which takes in the event. Now we're going to have a button, so I might just actually do the shape of it first before I get into the state and the button. But we will have a text field here, self-closing, and I'm going to call this ID, and the ID is just coming from Material UI on React, so I'm just using their sort of way they do it there as a guide, and that's probably how you want to do most things. Just using the resources available and the documentation and using that as a guide for whatever the current release is. Nevertheless, let's just continue adding our props to this text field. We can say add to do, we can have some helper text, this can be enter a to do item, just change that to the lowercase. It will have a value, and this will be related to the input. So we're going to have some sort of input on the state, and because we're doing that, we may as well write what the state is. So in our application here, we're going to have some sort of state, and this state relates to the search. To the add to do state. So we're going to have some input here, and this is going to be equal to blank initially. So that means on our onSubmit, now we have access to that, so we can prevent the default, which is we're going to have a button. So we need to the default for a button is to submit and it'll request to the page. So we need to prevent that default from occurring with the event default on the onSubmit, which is called through the form onSubmit. And we will actually have some props passed into the add to do. So we'll come back to this, but let's just finish up our button. So that means we can say and there's also going to be this variant here equal to outlined. Now there's going to be, okay, so in the search bar there was this on change, and that called the parent or the props change. But when we change this text field, we don't necessarily want to do that, but we do want to do something. And the thing that we want to do is we want to actually change the state of this local add to do component. So I'm going to copy this method, and so when we type in the text box on change, which takes the event, we don't need to prevent default because we're not submitting anything just yet. but we can say this dot set state, and we can get the input state by destructuring that, and we can just get the target value of whatever's in there. So what's happening is I haven't rendered the component yet, but we're going, I'll just finish this off so we can have a visual of what's going on. So, and this will become a lot clearer once it's visually there for us. So we'll have this button, and I'll call it, have some text in it saying add. And you know, we can give it the styling however we want it. And let's just say that that's 200 pixels, you know, there's a certain height of the button, which is 55 pixels. The particular variant of this button is contained. The color, let's make this equal to primary. And most importantly, this type is equal to submit. So we're going to have this form which has the input and the button, and we wrap it in a form because the form has access to this onSubmit button function that can be called when you click the button. This type submit, the form recognizes that, so that on submit it calls this function on submit. And what on submit will do, rather than actually submitting to a new page or anything like that, what it can do is it can add the to-do to the list. But recall that the to-do is actually in the parent, in the app. So that means we need to actually pass something into that. So this dot props dot add to do, and I'm going to explain it the other way around once it's been written. But we want to get the state. So recall that the state is changing, like relative to this add to do component, because we type something in the input. The value of the state's changing, and on the change, this is where it calls this function here to set the state based on that target value, the event target value, and that updates the state to whatever it is. And then when we click the submit, the on submit from the form with the submit button, this will call, this will get the state from this area, so this add to do area, i.e. the whatever's been added into the as a string into the input field, and then that can be handled in the parent. So if I go back to the parent and I add an add to do below the search bar, so I add this component in here, add to do. Now I had this add to do property here that I've called it, although you would call it here. And we can actually just create a function to handle this situation called this dot add to do. Now we need to import add to do here, and we also need to handle the adding or add to do. So let's do that. So okay, let's just do it above the render here, and this is going to be an asynchronous function, but we need to use you know, the ES6 sort of function, that arrow function, and we can do this by using this async keyword here. And what we're doing is we're just grabbing the title, whatever the title is, because you know that's the input we're getting is the title. So So whatever that is, and this is where we can update the state in this area to append to the existing to-dos. So we can actually make a fake request. Now, in a real application, we probably have our own server, our own API that we can make requests to and, you know, save something to a database or something like that. But in this case, we are going to make a fake request for the purposes of the React demonstration. So that's why I've used this as sync keyword here. So I can make this request to JSON placey hold slash to-dos, and it doesn't really matter, you're just making a fake request here. So what I can do is have some data associated with this request, and you know, there's going to be the method, post, it's going to have some headers just to say that, you know, the content type is of the JSON format, so application/JSON, and we can just stringify our body with JSON.stringify, and we have the title, which is title, so I might explicitly do it instead of the shortcut because I'm going to have this other property here where it's going to be completed false by default. So okay, so a to-do has an ID, a title, and a completed status. So we can make a fake request, which is a post request. All we need to pass in is the title, because that's what we type in. So we just make this fake post request to JSON placeholder, and in the body we need it to be in the JSON format because we've specified this application JSON format. That's what the JSON placeholder API likes, is that format. So I have stringified this JSON object where we have the title as a key with the title whatever we typed in, and by default everything's not completed, so I've said completed to false. So, you know, we await for that response to occur, and once again after that has occurred we want the response, the JSON response. So I can just say response JSON equals await response dot JSON. Now we just need to make up some random ID, because recall there's a ID, title and completed that needs to be passed here. So that means I can just make up one. So I have the response JSON. So on that response JSON I can just access the ID, and I can just say, you know, I'll take the floor, and this is a common pattern you see to get a round number. So we can get a random number and times on 16 plus 5, and don't worry too much about this. This is just getting a random number between 5 and 20, and because I've got, you know, IDs 1 to 5, I want some random ones between 5 and 20, 6 and 20, and you know, obviously when you submit to a database it's going to have the auto increment or something like that, so you know, this is just sort of a dummy mock version of that. But now that I have access to the response JSON with the new ID for that request, I can set the state, and we can do this. So to set the state we can pass in the destructured area of interest, so we just wanted to update the to-dos and not the search field at all. And that's just an array of the to-dos, so we can take the existing state using the spread operator, and we can just access the state to-dos, and that's going to be everything that's already existing in the state, plus also the response JSON. And because we posted the title and the completed to false, we're going to get those back for us in addition to this random ID and the user ID that's been generated by them. And we can actually console log this as well. So I'm using ES7 snippets, so I can just use CLG and I can console log this state here. So now if I type something in, so let's just say I type in washing and I add something here, it actually makes the request to JSON placey hold. It, you know, it generates a random ID between 5 and 20. It says that it's not completed, although we haven't set that functionality out yet to indicate if it's completed or not. And I might cross it out if it's completed and have it ticked. And yeah, so that re-renders and updates the state for us and adds it to the list for us. So that's awesome. Now I might do a similar thing for delete, but before I do, I'm just going to recap what happened there. So let's start from the beginning. In our application, our main application, we have the one-way flow of data from the parent to the children. So the main data, i.e. the 5 to-dos from JSON placeholder, that has been rendered after the component's been mounted. Now, in our rendering of the HTML DOM, we can inject our components here, and in particular we have this add to do component, and we can pass this prop in add to do, which calls this add to do function. And the way it calls this add to do function that we just created is, you know, you type something in to the text field in the add to do, it detects what you've written, it sets the state locally to the add to do component, and then when you click the submit button for the text field, you click this button, and in the text field, whatever text is there, you know, you can get the that event target value, and because that's set the state, you can get the input of the state of this local add to do, and this will submit it, right? And because it's been submitted, React has detected, you know, a state change and something happening, and we call this props add to do. So, you know, we have this add to do property here, and then this calls the method this add to do, and this goes to this function. We make the asynchronous request, and we get back our result, and after we get back our result, and we can even log it, we set the state, and because we're setting the state, this calls the rendered function, and then we can access the to-dos because we have the to-dos in this state, in this application, and we can go ahead and, you know, add the to-do and show the filtered to-dos if that's necessary as well, or being interacted with. So that's awesome. So okay, let's do a similar thing using that logic for the delete component. Well, there won't be a delete component. In the to-do, we have this delete forever icon with this style here. So we want to click on this and we want it to do something, right? But now unlike the add to do, which was just the child of app, now we're in to do, which is a child of to do list, which is a child of app.js. So we can see that we're nested deeper into the hierarchy here. So what we need to do is we need to actually well, let's just pass our prop in first. So from app, on our to-do list, we need to go through it twice. So we want to delete from the global state, or that state in the application here, but we need to go through the to-do list to do that. So that means on the to-do list, we need to have this prop here, and I'll call it delete to do, and this will be calling this function on this class delete to do. And delete to do is going to be similar to this, but I'm just going to make it simpler just to try and get something working here. And I'm just going to say delete, oops, delete to do, and I'll call this delete to do. So there's this property here, delete to do, being passed to do list, and its prop is to call this method here. So if I go to do list, there's also going to have access to a particular prop, and it's going to have access to this prop's delete to do, but I'm also going to have another prop on the to do here called delete to do, and this is going to access that prop that we just passed in. So the data flowing from the parent flowing to the child, meaning that we, if we want to do something in the parent, we need to do that through props and state. And we have this delete to do. It calls this delete to do function, which is just console logging for now. And this delete to do that's calling this can be referenced in this delete to do, but we're going to need the particular to do to delete. So we delete the to do on the to do, and this dot props delete to do is referencing the one from the app, and then this delete to do will be referencing the one that's going to happen in the to do itself. So it's in this to do itself that we want the deletion to happen, but we need to pass in the ID. So how are we going to do this? Well, we can access we're passing in the delete, or we want to do something on click, so we want to click this button. So there's this on click method that we can use, and we can access this dot props dot delete to do it, because we're sort of going up the tree here. So we're starting here to do, we want to click a button, i.e. we want to click this to do rubbish can, and we want the ID that we're deleting, so we can delete it from the state, but we've got to go through the component list, pass that through as a prop, and then handle that in the application by deleting it from the state there and re-rendering it. So one thing to note here is we want to get this particular ID from the to-do, and we want to be able to access that in the app. And in our app, notice that we have this delete to do here, and this delete to do, it will actually take the ID in. But because of the hierarchy and the components, this is why we prefer to actually use this arrow syntax, because we need to pertain to the particular ID that's going to be passed into it. And to do that, we can do something called binding in JavaScript. So we can actually get this delete to do, and we can actually bind it to this particular instance of to do with the ID of the particular instance. So basically what this is doing is, because we're on the to-do component itself, there's going to be multiple to-do components. But if I need access to the particular ID, we need to bind this delete to do component such that we have access to this particular ID. So we pass in this ID here, and then this gets passed up to the to-do list here, and this is just an intermediate step so we can access it in the to-do list here. So we can delete a particular to-do through that intermediary step, but for that intermediary step we need to have access to that particular to-do ID. We do that with the binding here, and we can thus call the delete to-do for that particular ID. So I might just console log that particular ID that we're clicking, and now if I click on this I get 1, if I click on this I get 3, and we are now able to get that particular ID. And that's very useful because we're going to need to use that to make a fake request. So because we're going to do a similar thing, we can make this an async function as the add to do. This time we can just delete it, so we can just say something like this. We don't actually need the response in this case, so we can just await for the fetch API to make the delete request. But in addition to the to-dos, we need the particular ID of the to-do we're deleting. So we can use ES6 template literals, and we can use a backtick, so we can use this $ curly brace to access that particular ID that's being passed in. And after that's occurred, this is where we can set the state. So we can set the state, and this is going to be done by performing a destructuring of the to-dos array. And we can just take the entire to-dos array that we have in existence, but we just want to filter out a particular to-do, and that particular to-do is going to be filtered out when the to-do that we're looking at is not equal to the ID that's been passed in. And we can console log that, of course, to console.log the state. Of course it's just going to happen as well, but okay, so we've got an error here, and this is happening delete to do equals async ID JSON placeholder. Oh, there's just a missing bracket here. Save that. Now if I click delete 2, it actually deletes 2. So what's happened, just to recap that, is there's a delete icon. We click the delete icon, and for whatever particular to do, it takes that ID, it passes it through its parent to the to-do list so it can pass it to the app component. The app component handles that delete to do with that method. It calls the fake API request to JSON placeholder to make the fake delete request, and then we set the state of our application so that we just filter out the particular to-do. So we loop through everything in our state, all the to-dos, and if one of those IDs is not equal to the ID that we passed in, that means that's the ID we want to filter out. So that's what gets deleted. So when we make the set state, we're calling this render function again, and that's just to-dos are coming from the state that we just set, and that just renders it to the image to the browser for us seamlessly. Okay, so we've done the delete functionality, the search functionality, and the add functionality. Now the only thing I want to do is just cross out the to-do. So let's say we don't want to delete it, we just want to keep it there, but we just want to cross it out, and we just need to determine if this is checked or not. And also when we load the page initially, we want to have the state show us which ones have been completed or not, because some of them, if you look in this array here, yeah, like this one here is completed, but there's no showing of that. So we can actually do that in a very similar way, and we will be in the to-do, and we need to go back up the tree again. So let's just start at the app component. It's logically easier to think about it from that source of data where the state is flowing down the hierarchy, but you also need to consider it in the reverse where you're starting at the child and passing the data back up to the app. So what we can do is we can pass in another prop in the to-do list because we want to access if it's complete or not, and we can do this by adding a property here. And I'll just call this display complete, and this will be calling this dot display complete, and display complete equals something that does a console log, just as a placeholder for this function here. And so we have this display complete prop being passed into our to-do list. So we go to our to-do list and we can pass that into our to-do, this mark complete prop on the to-do. Oh, what did I call it? Display complete. Display complete. Actually, I'm defining the property name here, but I just want to keep the same name. So I display complete, and this is going to be equal to this dot props dot display, and this is the one that needs to be the same, but I'm keeping them both the same just to avoid confusion. So this is the intermediate step here. And now if I come to the to-do itself, I'm able to determine the completion. So on the actual checkbox, this is where I'm going to have there's an on change event, but firstly I just want to say checked equals to completed, where completed is coming from the destructured properties that have been passed to that component. So now when I reload, you can see that it automatically ticks this for fine for us as it is completed, because we just set that up. So now what we want to do is we don't want to just have it on the first load, but we want to have it in the case that we click the button checkbox. We want to call a function that gets passed up the component tree and then changes the state in the main app. And that's done in a very, very similar way to how we just did it for delete. So what we can do is on the actual checkbox, there is this onChange method. So that's been built in for us. There's this onChange property that can be called, so it detects any changes, i.e. if we click the checkbox. And we can call this .props display, what do we call it? Display complete. And we want to, instead of deleting the particular ID for the particular to do, we want to delete, or we'll change the particular to do the completed property, but to do that we need a unique way to identify that. So once again we bind this particular to do with the ID of that. So we can make the change to the checkbox. We click the checkbox, and then that calls its parents display complete. That calls here, which calls the app display complete, and it's using that we're able to actually change the state. So we're calling this display complete function here, and if I click this, it now console logs that, so we have access to that in the parent component. Now we also are going to have the ID passed in, so let's just confirm that. So yep, you've got the ID. Now what we need to do is we need to set the state such that that particular ID is going to have its completed attribute modified. So in the to-dos part of the state, we can destructure that, and then we can set it to this .state.todos, and we just want to map through our to-dos here. And it's always preferable to use map over for each when you can. And we just want to do a check here, essentially, because we either just want to return the particular to-do, but if the to-do ID from the state is going to be equal to the ID of the particular to-do that we're clicked on, then we want to change the object completed. So the to-do, the completed attribute on the particular to-do using object notation by setting it to the opposite of what it is. So if it's false, it'll be true. If it's true, it'll be false. And you know, we can just console.log the to-do that we changed, and we can of course return the to-do. So now we get this loading here, slow for the network request in that case. We click on to here, and you know, we get back the to-dos. We're mapping through them, we're returning them, and we can see that for this second one here we've got true. Now if I click this here, now I get completed set to false. So we're almost complete. I'll just add a visual thing here, and that is to cross out it on the list. So if we go back to our to-do component, we can actually, you know, we either want it crossed out or not crossed out. So we're going to need some sort of conditional styling. So I'm just going to have this variable here. I'm going to call it to-do text style. And if it's completed, if this to-do is completed, I'm going to use the line through CSS class. Otherwise, I'm just going to have none. So this is referring to the text decoration. And if we go to the typography of our of the to-do, so the ID, the title, we can actually add a style by using the double curly brackets, so once for JavaScript, once for the object, and using the JSX with the camel casing, we can set the decoration equal to the to-do text style. So I can just save that, and if we look at our application, boom, we can see it crossed out. And if I click it, it changes the state, doesn't cross it out. If I choose this, crosses it out. So let's just recap the entire application here. So we're making a network request, and we are getting the data back, the to-dos. Some are completed, some are not. We can filter through our to-dos. We can add a to-do. It makes a network request, then we edit the state. We can delete a to-do, and we can also cross off a particular to-do. And we've done this using the material UI. So I really hope this was a helpful introduction to React. And as you can start to see, when we're passing state through and props through multiple components, it starts to get a little bit more, well, for a simple app it's not too bad, but you can imagine as the application grows and there's multiple layers on the hierarchy, we can start to see how state could be a bit of an issue. So something I would like to look at is looking at state management options, and might take a look at Redux. So please subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.